Hello and welcome to Buying into the Future, where we discuss all things public procurement. Reducing carbon dioxide emissions have become a priority for everyone these days. And today we will be discussing a way of bringing CO2 reduction into public procurement. And we're very pleased that we have two guests with us today who are going to explain this to us a little more and how it works and what it means for those involved in public procurement. And I'd like to ask them to introduce themselves to you now. Harold, if I could start with you, please.
Thank you. So my name is Harold Versteeg. I work for the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management in the Netherlands. My role there is that I'm involved in sustainability and procurement. So around 2011, I already started working with the carbon performance ladder. And since that time, I am one of the members of the College of Experts that decides together on what do you have to do to get this certificate. And at the moment, even I'm the chairman. So I know the whole history of how it developed. I only missed the first part, but I know quite a bit about how it is at the moment and why it is so.
Jean-Louis, if you'd be so kind as to introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Jean-Louis Tourneux. I'm the general manager of ASEA, which is a French boutique consultancy specialized in sustainable procurement. Myself, I've been in this space for the past 20 years, a few years in France, then went to Australia for 10 years and came back to France 4 years ago, now heading a beautiful team of passionate experts on sustainable procurement.
Excellent. So both of you very much involved in this area in a number of aspects. Today, of course, we're going to be focusing on issues like the CO2. So Harold, could you tell us a little bit more about the background to the ladder? What was the idea behind it? Where did it come from? What it is intended to achieve?
It was, I think, sometime before 2010 within the Railways Agency of the Ministry of Infrastructure, there was a motivated group of people that were talking about sustainability with their suppliers. And the suppliers complained at the time. They said, you have all these ambitions on carbon management, but in your procurement, you don't differentiate between us, who have invested in all kinds of green technology, and the old-fashioned competitors that have not invested. So please, could you practice what you preach? And then the group of people in the Railways Agency developed the first version of the carbon performance ladder. What happened then? So they implemented it in all their procurements, and it worked very well in that niche sector. So then the Director General of the agency that I'm working for, we are involved with the highways and the waterways. Our Director General spoke to his colleague of the Railway Agency, and he said, well, maybe we should start using the same system as well. But then, of course, it becomes bigger. And at that time, there was no foundation like today's, like SCAO, who manages the whole system. So then the railway agency said, well, yeah, but if other people start using it as well, then that creates a lot of work for us because then we have to do much more about the whole carbon management system. And that's not our core business. So then together, the railway agency and our agency, the Rijkswaterstaat, we together created, or let's say we helped this foundation to start up. But that's from the organizational point of view. But the real focus of the system was on not defining exactly what organizations have to do, but make organizations think for themselves how they can reduce their carbon emissions within their own organizations and within their supply chain. And the idea already from the very early beginning was that it should have several levels of advancedness, levels of maturity, so that everyone can enter and in a natural way develop skills and the capacity to reduce carbon emissions in their own organization and in their value chains. And then, of course, if you have the highest level, you have more chance to get the contract than if you are on the lowest level, or even if you're not even on any level. So that's the whole system, to give an award criterion to organizations that actively work on carbon emission reduction and can prove that by showing a certificate.
Just a little bit more about those levels, because obviously this is where the idea of the ladder comes from as well, that one progresses from level to level. How did you decide the criteria for those? Do you know how those individual levels were decided?
So at each level, there's level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the moment. So level 1, 2, 3 is all focused on the organization itself. So what can I do? I'm fully responsible for the electricity that my organization uses, the fuel that my organization uses in my trucks or in my cars, in the heating systems. So you can collect all the data, create insight in different factories, in different buildings, in different processes, in different business units, whatever. And that is not difficult to start. So the first level, just create, find out what other people are doing. There's a real natural growth in levels. In the beginning, people that have no knowledge don't need expensive consultants to get to level 1 or to level 2. Level 2 is I know now how many kilowatt hours or how many liters, but you start thinking about what does that mean in carbon numbers. So you create knowledge already, which are more important activities if I look at it from the point of view of carbon emissions. Which factories, which processes, which customers. So you create already sort of this kind of insight. And of course, then you have to explain all those things. And at level 3, you are a fully matured organization that understands how carbon emissions work. In your own organization, you use your own sphere of influence. You implement with high ambition the measures that you can implement. So then for a lot of companies, let's say for the most organizations that are certified, that is the level that they find, or actually that they found maybe until 5 years ago, a very fully mature carbon management organization. But then the whole way of thinking, but maybe if you are an organization like a consultancy company, it's not so important what you do in your own organization. You have an office, you have some people driving cars, but you make designs, for instance, for big factories or big bridges or highway systems or energy systems. So the impact of those organizations is much more in the products that they make and the advice, the consultancy, the designs that they create. For instance, in a building company, it's usually not their own energy consumption that is the most important. It is the energy and the carbon emissions in their supply chain for the production of cement, the production of steel, the logistics. So at the levels 4 and 5, you have to create that kind of insight.
Jean-Louis, if I remember correctly, you are looking at implementing this system in France. So obviously, and Harold made reference to this, there are certain advantages to implementing the ladder in a particular country, in a particular sector. So could you enlighten us just a little bit on what kind of incentive there is for people involved in procurement to start climbing their way up the ladder?
So in France, because we do have some specifics in terms of public procurement regulations and jurisprudence, we have chosen actually not to use the same evaluation mechanism as in the Netherlands. Harold may explain that in detail, but in the Netherlands, they use a mechanism which will reduce fictiously the price of a proposal based on the level of performance proposed by the candidate to a request for tender on the carbon performance ladder. Where in France, what we do is we integrate the carbon performance ladder as a distinct carbon evaluation criteria, which enables suppliers that propose to achieve a higher level of carbon performance ladder rating to get a better score during the RFT. So it works like a standard, I would say, quality related evaluation criteria, and depending on the ambition that you offer to your client in terms of the level that you will achieve, you get a better score. It's interesting to point out that the CPL governance enabled us to make this adjustment based on our country specifics. Here in France, we do have some specifics, and it's very important that the system, the framework, has some level of flexibility to fit our needs.
Let's say that I'm wanting to go for I want to go for a tender. There's a tender come out. I want to make an offer. I've never been involved in the performance ladder before. What kind of things would I be expected to include, declare, or whatever within the tendering process to achieve the points, Jean-Louis, for example, that you just mentioned?
You mean as a supplier? So the procuring entity will include in the request for tender documents that evaluation criteria on carbon and say, well, tell us as a supplier what level of performance you promise to achieve if you win the contract, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And so what the suppliers then need to do is to decide internally what is their level of maturity regarding the carbon performance ladder framework, current maturity, and what they think they could achieve on the contract, and decide whether they want to go for a high level or moderate level based on investment versus benefits. And that's where the carbon performance ladder is a very smart instrument because it doesn't actually require applicants to an RFT to already be certified. So there's no idea of excluding those that are not in the framework yet, but it actually encourages all suppliers to promise to achieve a level of performance if they win the contract. So it really encourages very strongly all suppliers to, if they want to remain competitive, because they will be scored on this, it encourages them to be ambitious. And then if they win the contract, well, there will already be good news. We do have the contract, but let's get aligned with the level of performance we've promised within our proposal.
So that was the point I wanted to come on to next, because you mentioned something that for me as an outsider, as it were, it struck me as interesting. You mentioned that in the tendering process, those putting out the tender will specify that they want certain conditions as regards performance. The supplier in response will say, okay, I promise to get to this level or to be at this level of the ladder. So once that contract's been awarded, how is that compliance checked? Because as you mentioned, you don't have to have started when you make the bid, but once it's been assigned, is there any form of checking on this? And if there is, how does that happen? Harold?
The way the procurement laws work, as buyers, we are only allowed in the tender process to ask things to be done on the specific contract. So that is very important. So the promise that the supplier makes, I will do your work, the specific things that you want me to do now, make the bridge or make the railroad or whatever, or build the office, with a carbon management level of maturity. And then it is up to the supplier whether they think, well, this is maybe just a one contract that we will do this carbon performance management system. Then they don't even have to get specifically the carbon performance ladder certificate. That they can just do the things on the one project and offer that as proof. But that is not the way in general how it works, because in general, companies that decide doing this on one project, they are clever enough to think, okay, then we have to do the proof on each individual project. Let's go for the organizational certification scheme, where we organize it at the organizational level, and we can use that as proof for all the projects where we have to. But your question is very to the point, because how is it checked? So the system has external certification institutes. So the regular companies that also verify for environmental quality or management systems. So that's all the big certification organizations. They do an audit, a yearly audit, where they specifically ask in the system, where are you using this as proof that you are doing things on the project level? And then when there are 24 projects where they have been awarded the contract because they have a carbon performance promise, then there's a sample is checked. Let's say if there's 24 projects, maybe there's 8 or 12 projects that because that's the clever thing about the size of the project. So there's a way of deciding how big the sample should be. And they then really verify if the projects have been done from the very beginning that the contract was awarded. So then the company does not yet have the certificate. But when the audit is done, they are awarded the certificate, and the certificate actually says, we have been able to prove that in the last year, you are doing your projects at the right quality level, and you have implemented in your organization all these extra things. And this is actually what I love about this system, is that we are only allowed to ask things at the project level, but there are some things in the carbon ladder and the CO2 ladder that they have to do at the organizational level that we are not allowed to ask on the project level. So it is the organization themselves that decide. For us, it's more practical to go for the certification route, and we accept that there are some things that go beyond what is asked at the project level.
Thank you. Yes, Jean-Louis.
That auditing mechanism that Harold has just explained is key in contexts of public procurement. Many people I talk to are concerned with greenwashing. That is to say that you have suppliers during a request for tender that explain to you that they're going to do extraordinary things in relation to environmental management and carbon. And then once the contract starts, different things may happen. Well, they will not keep their promise, and or you will not take the time to verify compliance with requirements. And so it happens so much and so often that having in the carbon performance ladder framework the requirement to be submitted to a third-party audit 1 year after contract award is an excellent tool, and it really helps avoiding greenwashing. It's not only a contracting clause that will stipulate that you will need to be submitted to an audit after 1 year of contract implementation. There's also a clause that will stipulate that if you don't reach the promised level of carbon performance ladder, you will have financial penalties that will be relative to the gap that may be observed and identified by the external auditor after 1 year. So you have that auditing mechanism, which is complemented by financial penalties, which really ensure you that what was promised will be done.
We were talking from the supply side about suppliers honoring what they've offered in the contract, etc. But of course, suppliers are also procurers in a sense as well, because they're going to be buying things in that they use services as well as goods, materials, what have you. In your experience, and I know you work on the procurement side, but this is a global kind of thing I wanted to look at. How much control do suppliers have themselves on their own supply chain? In other words, if they're buying from Mr. X or Mrs. X, and they're told that this has been produced sustainably and they take that at face value, does this system take into account that there is only a certain extent to which a supplier in a particular contract can actually control what's gone on further down the supply chain?
Responding to your first question, Steve, well, it really depends on what this supply chain looks like, depending on the sector, or we should say actually supply chains with an S that a supplier needs to operate. So if you take a consultancy just like my company, we have quite a simple supply chain. And if you think about our carbon emissions, they will mainly be around the electricity we consume and the travel we make. But if you think about a major construction company, to build a major building, they will need to rely on a bunch of subcontracting activities, services that may be very numerous, and also a set of products, equipment, and materials that they need to build the building. And those products may have very complex supply chains spanning across multiple countries with many different players, and the capacity to influence those suppliers and the suppliers of your suppliers may be very limited. So when you do have complex product supply chains like that, you may need to think in an innovative way, in a creative way about how you can reduce your impact. So you may first buy less of those products. Second, you may find maybe some alternative solutions to those products that may be more local, less complex, and produce less emissions. But you also have third-party certification. You have carbon assessments per product. And you may also need to engage in sectorial initiatives to just collaborate with your peers or competitors to find solutions. So I guess responding to your question about how difficult it is, well, first, it is difficult to trace all your products. So you need to prioritize the products you want to work on. And then you need to sometimes find new solutions. And those solutions usually include collaborating with others.
You are exactly describing the process that a certified organization has to go through. The interesting thing is that the certification process is exactly the same for a municipality or a ministry like ours, because we are also certified. Because every organization is both a buyer and a seller. We all have a place in the supply chain, in supply chains, as Jean-Louis has mentioned. But of course, you have to be aware that, for instance, if we buy asphalt, we are a very important customer. So there our buying power is much more strong than when you are a small municipality. But it is really interesting that you see the power of cooperation in practice. If several municipalities together work on procuring, let's say, zero emission digging machines, then maybe they might influence a contractor. So you need collaboration exactly in those places where your own influence is not big enough. And then, of course, the big elephants, of course, are in the room are the steel industry, the cement industry. Those kinds of industries, huge investments are necessary to make sustainable steels, alternatives to cement. So that really needs multinational incentives. And I think that is why we are also happy that now this whole way of thinking and the sort of incentives we use are more unified. That's in France, in Germany, in Ireland, in Portugal, people also start influencing in the same way the same kind of companies. And we hope that in the end creates the power to change.
Yeah, adding on this is the beauty of the carbon performance ladder is its flexibility. So it provides a standard tool, that any public procurement entity and any supplier can use. So it's the same tool, the same framework, but within that framework, you do have the flexibility to define your ways to reduce your carbon emissions, and they will be different according to sectors, but also for each company of that same sector. That's really important because the suppliers, they know their business, they know their supply chains, and they are best placed to find the right solutions. But with the carbon performance ladder framework, the public procurement officials, they do have a simple framework to engage their suppliers with. So they are kind of removing the complexity of identifying solutions and letting the suppliers decide which solutions they should implement. I think that's very smart.
So, gentlemen, in summary, looking forward, we've discussed the background to the performance ladder. We've discussed how it might work in action, etc. As we look forward, what does success ultimately look like for the performance ladder?
At the highest level of ambition, it means that there's a community, that the supply chain becomes a community that collaborates on creating a common goal of reducing the emissions of our common supply chain. That is the success. And of course, that needs to go down to zero or as close as possible. But I think that is what we intend to create, that both cooperation within the supply chain between, for instance, a designing company, road authority, builders, material suppliers of machines, they are all focused on how do we have to change the way our supply chain works. And that's what we call vertical collaboration. And that's a horizontal collaboration that different building companies also share or at least compete on how sustainable they are. And that they together share that knowledge to increase the speed of reduction of carbon emissions. That is what the success of the carbon emission system should aim for.
Do you have any idea about the future, Jean-Louis? What your measure of success is now that you have started implementing this?
Yeah, well, the problem we have in France is that carbon has become the number one priority of public entities in terms of procurement. So how can all those public procurers use the power of public procurement to help businesses transition to a low carbon economy? And the reality is that today in France, we're not moving fast enough. It's really slow. And we have a bunch of, isolated pilots and experiments that are taking place with different mechanisms and frameworks. So for complex services and works, public procurers are struggling to progress. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the time, they don't have the knowledge to progress fast. Well, the carbon performance ladder, because it has been around in the Netherlands for 15 years, it's a proven tool to industrialize the integration of carbon evaluation criteria, into RFTs. I think, Harold, in the Netherlands, you have, I guess, around a few thousands of RFTs every year, requests for tenders that use the carbon performance ladder. And we can see the impact it does have in the Netherlands. Well, success of the carbon performance ladder in France is, reaching the same level of mainstreaming the CPL than as in the Netherlands. We need hundreds of public entities using that simple tool to encourage in a standardized way their suppliers to progress on carbon. And we already have, through our French pilots, we already have multi-billion worth of RFTs and contracts, including the carbon performance ladder already. And the feedback is really outstanding. So I'm very excited and optimistic about how it's going to develop in France. But let's talk about it in 5 years' time and see where we're at, because as on many things, the Dutch have taken a bit of advance in terms of sustainability, but we are trying to come back to them as quickly as possible.
Gentlemen, I have to draw this to a close now. Thank you so very much, both of you, for your time and for your expertise and for sharing the information with us. For those of you listening in, thank you very much for joining us today. Please do remember to keep checking back, as we will be adding more podcasts to the series, and we look forward to you joining us in those. So I shall thank you very much indeed and look forward to having you with us in the next podcast. Goodbye for now.